Hello, you're on Behind the Photo. Subscribe, leave a like, and write one word in the comments what you feel when you look at old photographs. Now take a breath. The story begins. Enjoy the watch.
6 rooms appeared in a house in Breathitt County, Kentucky, between 1897 and 1903. No one built them. No lumber was purchased. No carpenter was hired. No nails were driven. No foundation was laid. The rooms simply appeared, one each winter, always in December, always furnished, always warm, always where the exterior wall of the house had been the morning before. The widow who lived in the house walked through her own hallway one December morning and found a door that had not existed the previous night. And behind that door was a room she had never seen, with curtains hung with care and a chair positioned beside a window that looked out onto the same yard. She had looked at her whole life, but from an angle that should not have been possible. Her name was Ruth Hensley. She lived in that house for 24 years after the first room appeared. She never explained the rooms. She never asked anyone to explain them. She simply lived in a house that grew. A county surveyor documented the property in 1903. His report was so unusual that the state of Kentucky sent a representative. The representative spent one night in the house. His account was classified. I found a copy of the surveyor's report in the Breathitt County courthouse basement in a box marked Property, Miscellaneous. It had not been opened since 1941. Tonight we read it. Ruth Hensley was born Ruth Combs in 1854 in a hollow in the southeastern part of Breathitt County, Kentucky, in the region of the Appalachian Mountains that people in that era called the Bloody Breathitt, a nickname the county had earned through decades of feuding, violence, and the particular intensity of life. In a place where the law was distant and the mountains were close, she was the third daughter of a subsistence farmer named Elijah Combs, who had worked the same 30 acres of hillside ground that his father had worked before him, growing what would grow in the thin soil and hunting what moved in the dense forest above the hollow. She married a man named Thomas Hensley in 1875 at the age of 21. Thomas was a timber worker, age 24, who had come into the county from Pike County to the east, following the timber operations that were beginning to move through the mountains as the railroads pushed deeper into eastern Kentucky. He was, by the accounts that survive in the county records and in the oral histories collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, a steady man, quiet, reliable, the kind of person who built things carefully and maintained them with the particular attention of a man who understood that what he built with his hands was the only thing standing between his family and the weather. He built the house in 1876. It was a 4-room cabin on a ridge above the North Fork of the Kentucky River, about 7 miles from the county seat of Jackson. The Breathitt County tax records for 1876, which I checked and which are real, and which are available to anyone who visits the courthouse in Jackson, describe the property as frame dwelling, 4 rooms, 20 acres, assessed value $40, 4 rooms, a kitchen, a front room, and 2 bedrooms. That was the house Thomas Hensley built. He died in 1894 at the age of 43 in a timber accident, a falling tree, the county death record says, though the WPA oral histories suggest the circumstances were more complicated than the record indicates, involving a dispute with a foreman that may or may not have contributed to the accident. Ruth was 40 years old. They had no children. She was alone in the 4-room house on the ridge. For 3 years after Thomas's death, the house had 4 rooms. 4 rooms when Ruth woke in the morning, 4 rooms when she went to bed at night, 4 rooms in spring, summer, autumn. 4 rooms in the first 3 Decembers of her widowhood, 1894, 1895, 1896. In December of 1897, the house had 5. The first room appeared on or about December 14, 1897. The exact date is uncertain because Ruth Hensley did not keep a diary and did not report the room's appearance to anyone for several weeks. The date is an estimate, based on the account she eventually gave to a neighbor named Oda Hayes, age 51, who lived on the adjacent property about a mile down the ridge. Oda Hayes was interviewed by a WPA field worker in 1937, and her account of Ruth's description of the first room's appearance is preserved in the WPA oral history files for Breathitt County, which are held at the University of Kentucky Library in Lexington. I read the transcript. It is real. It is available to researchers. This is what Oda Hayes told the field worker. She said Ruth came down the ridge to her house in early January of 1898, which was unusual because Ruth did not visit often in winter, and because the path between their properties was difficult in cold weather. Ruth was not agitated. She was not frightened. She was, Oda said, puzzled. The specific puzzlement of a practical woman who has encountered something that does not fit into the practical framework she has used to understand the world for 43 years. Ruth told Oda that she had gone to bed on the night of approximately December 14th in her usual bedroom, the back bedroom, the one Thomas had built on the eastern side of the house. She had woken in the morning and walked through the hallway toward the kitchen to start the fire in the stove. And in the hallway, on the left side, where the exterior wall of the house had been, the wall that faced south, the wall with the single window that looked out over the slope toward the river, there was a door that had not been there the night before. She stood in the hallway and looked at it. It was a wooden door, hung on iron hinges, with a simple latch. It was the same type of door as the other doors in the house. The same wood, the same construction, the same hardware. It looked like it belonged. It looked like it had always been there, except that Ruth had lived in this house for 21 years, and she knew, with the certainty of a woman who has walked the same hallway 10,000 times, that there had never been a door in that wall. She opened it. Behind the door was a room. The room was approximately 12 feet by 14 feet, roughly the same size as the front room of the original house. It had a wooden floor, plank walls, a ceiling of the same rough-hewn boards as the rest of the house. It had one window, facing south, with curtains, white cotton curtains, clean, hung with care on a wooden rod. There was a chair beside the window, a simple wooden chair with a woven seat, positioned as though someone had placed it there specifically, so that a person could sit and look out at the slope toward the river. There was a small table beside the chair. On the table there was nothing. The room was warm, not the warmth of a room that has been heated by a stove or a fireplace. There was no stove, no fireplace, no visible source of heat. The warmth was simply present, the way warmth is present, in a room that has been occupied by a living body for a long time. The kind of warmth that lingers after someone has been sitting in a chair by a window for an afternoon. Ruth walked into the room. She examined the walls, the floor, the ceiling. She looked at the chair. She looked at the curtains. She went back out into the hallway and closed the door and stood there for a long time. Then she opened it again. The room was still there. She told Oda Hayes that she had checked the exterior of the house that morning. She walked around the building in the December cold and looked at where the new room should have been. On the south side, extending beyond what had been the exterior wall. The room was there. The house was larger than it had been the day before. The new room projected from the south wall as though it had been built onto the existing structure. with the same siding, the same roof line extended to cover it, the same foundation stones visible at the base. There were no construction marks, no sawdust, no nail heads bright with recent hammering, no raw wood edges where new boards had been joined to old. The room looked as though it had been part of the house for years, decades, as though it had always been there, and Ruth had simply not noticed it until now. Except Ruth had lived in this house for 21 years. She had walked its exterior 1,000 times. She had patched its siding. She had cleared brush from its foundation. She knew every board, every stone, every angle of every wall. The room had not been there on December 13th. It was there on December 14th. Oda Hayes told the WPA field worker that she had not known what to say to Ruth when Ruth told her this. She said she had suggested that perhaps Thomas had built the room before his death, and Ruth had somehow not noticed it. A suggestion that Oda herself acknowledged was absurd even as she made it. But that seemed preferable, in the moment, to the alternative. Ruth had looked at her and said, "Oda, I have lived in that house alone for 3 years. I walk through every room every day. The room was not there, and now it is, and I do not know what to do about it." Oda asked her if she was afraid. Ruth thought about it. She said, "No. The room is warm. The curtains are clean. The chair is comfortable. If something built it built it with care. I am not afraid of something that builds with care." She went home. She lived with the room. She used it. She sat in the chair by the window. She looked out at the slope toward the river. She occupied the space the way you occupy any room in your house. She did not tell anyone else about it. She did not report it to the county. She did not ask a minister to bless the house. She simply added the room to the geography of her daily life and continued. 11 months later, in December of 1898, there was another room. The second room appeared on the north side of the house. It was smaller than the first, approximately 10 feet by 10 feet. It had no window. It had a single shelf on one wall, empty. It was warm, like the first room. There was no visible source of heat. The third room appeared in December of 1899, the fourth in December of 1900, the fifth in December of 1901, the sixth in December of 1902. By the winter of 1903, Ruth Hensley's house had 10 rooms, the original 4 that Thomas had built in 1876, and 6 that had appeared, 1 each December, without explanation, without construction, without any process that Ruth or anyone else could observe or account for. Each room was different. Each had its own character, its own size, its own arrangement of windows or absence of windows, its own furniture. The third room had a bookshelf, empty. The fourth had a bed, a simple frame with a mattress, made up with sheets and a blanket, as though someone were expected. The fifth had a rocking chair and a small fireplace that was cold, but showed evidence of old fires, ash in the firebox, soot on the stones. The sixth had nothing in it at all. It was empty, bare, warm, and entirely without feature. Ruth described each room to Oda Hayes as it appeared, and Oda's WPA interview preserves those descriptions in the particular detail of a woman who had been listening to her neighbor's impossible accounts for 6 years, and who had, at some point, stopped trying to explain them and had simply started remembering them. The third room, December 1899, was the one that most disturbed Oda, not because of anything frightening about it, but because of the bookshelf. The bookshelf was built into the wall, floor to ceiling, with 12 shelves, each one empty. Ruth told Oda that when the room first appeared, she had thought the shelves might eventually hold books, that perhaps whatever was building the rooms was building a library for her. piece by piece. She had placed a few books on the shelves, a Bible, a hymnal, an almanac. In the morning, the books were on the floor, not thrown, placed. Set down carefully beside the shelf, spines up, as though whoever or whatever maintained the room had removed them with the care of a person who respects books, but who had not put them there and did not want them there. Ruth put the books back. In the morning, they were on the floor again. She stopped putting books on the shelves. The shelves remained empty for the rest of her life. The fourth room, the one with the bed, was the room Ruth most frequently used. She did not sleep in it. She told Oda she could not bring herself to sleep in a bed that had been made by whatever was making the rooms. But she would sit on the edge of the bed in the afternoons and look at the quilt that covered it. A handmade quilt, stitched in a pattern she recognized as double wedding ring. A pattern her mother had used. A pattern that Ruth herself had made for her own marriage bed in 1875. She told Oda that the quilt on the bed in the fourth room was not the quilt she had made, but it was the same pattern, executed with the same stitching, in the same colors, as though whatever had made it had seen her quilt and had reproduced it from memory. This detail stayed with Oda Hayes for 40 years. She repeated it to the WPA fieldworker in 1937, with the particular emphasis of a woman who has been carrying a fact that she cannot make sense of, and who is grateful, finally, to put it down on someone else's paper. Ruth used them all. She moved through her expanding house with the familiarity of a woman who has accepted that her house does not obey the rules she was raised to expect, and who has decided, in the practical way of mountain women who have survived harder things than unusual architecture, to use what she has been given and not to question it too loudly. Word spread slowly through the surrounding community. It did not spread far. The people of the Hollows in Breathitt County in 1900 did not travel widely or communicate quickly. But by 1902 or so, a handful of people in the Jackson area had heard some version of the story. The widow Hensley's house that keeps getting bigger. Most of them dismissed it. Some attributed it to the isolation and the loneliness of a woman who had been living alone on a ridge for 8 years. A few were curious enough to consider visiting, but the 7-mile ride from Jackson on bad roads discouraged all but the most determined. The county clerk, Wilbur Short, heard the story in early 1903 from a tax assessor who had noticed that the property's assessed value, $40 for a 4-room house, hadn't been revised since 1876, despite the property apparently having changed significantly. Short decided to send a surveyor. She told Oda Hayes about each new room as it appeared. Oda told her daughter. Her daughter told a friend. The friend mentioned it to the county clerk's office. And in the spring of 1903, a county surveyor named Josiah Pruitt, age 39, was dispatched to the Hensley property to document what was there. Josiah Pruitt was a practical man. He had been surveying properties in Breathitt County for 11 years, and he had seen a considerable variety of structures, from the grand houses of the timber barons in Jackson to the one-room cabins of the Hollows where families of 8 lived in less space than the timber barons allotted to their horses. He had documented properties that had been expanded, modified, rebuilt, and jury-rigged. In every way that ingenuity and poverty and the available materials could produce. He was not a man who was easily surprised by what a building could look like. The Hensley property surprised him. His report, filed with the Breathitt County Clerk's Office in June of 1903, runs to 11 pages. I read this line 3 times before I believed it. The report is real. It is in the courthouse basement. It is in the box marked Property, Miscellaneous. It has been there for over 120 years. Pruitt begins with the standard description of the property. 20 acres on the ridge, above the North Fork. Frame dwelling. He records the dimensions of the structure as he measured them in May of 1903. The house measured 62 feet along its longest axis. Thomas Hensley, in 1876, had built a house that measured approximately 30 feet long by 20 feet wide. The tax record confirms this. A 4-room house of 1,200 square feet. In 1903, 27 years later, the house measured 62 feet long by 38 feet wide. The square footage, as Pruitt calculated it, was approximately 2,350 square feet. The house had nearly doubled in size. Pruitt counted the rooms. He documented 10, 4 in what he identified as the original structure, based on the flooring, the wall construction, and the aging of the wood, and 6 in what he described, with obvious discomfort, as additions of uncertain origin. He wrote, "The 6 additional rooms are constructed of materials consistent with the original structure. The same species of timber, the same style of joinery, the same type of hardware. However, and I wish to be precise about this, the materials in the additional rooms do not show the aging that would be consistent with recent construction. The wood, in a room that Mrs. Hensley states, appeared in December of 1902, for example. A room that would have been less than 6 months old at the time of my inspection shows the same degree of weathering and patina as wood in the rooms built in 1876. The nails show the same degree of oxidation. The floor planks show the same degree of wear." He continued, "I have examined the junction points where the additional rooms meet the original structure. In a conventional addition, these junction points show evidence of the joining process. Fresh cut ends where new boards meet old. Differences in the grain pattern where new wood is fitted to existing wood. The small gaps and adjustments that result from attaching one structure to another. I find no such evidence in the Hensley house. The junction points are seamless. The additional rooms do not appear to have been attached to the original structure. They appear to have grown from it." I read this line, "They appear to have grown from it," and I stopped. I contacted the Breathitt County clerk's office. The box is real. The report is real. The surveyor's name appears in county employment records from 1892 to 1911. Josiah Pruitt was a real person who filed a real report that used the word grown to describe what had happened to a house in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Pruitt measured each room individually. He documented the furniture, the chair by the window in the first room, the bookshelf in the third, the bed in the fourth, the rocking chair in the fifth. He noted that the furniture showed the same anomalous aging as the rooms themselves. New rooms with old-looking furniture, pieces that appeared to have been used for decades despite being, according to Ruth Hensley's account, less than 6 years old. He asked Ruth who had built the rooms. She said, "Nobody built them." He asked her to explain. She said, "I go to bed in December. I wake up. There is a new room. That is all I know. That is all there is to know." Pruitt included her statement in his report without comment. He concluded the report with a recommendation that the county clerk refer the matter to the state, as the property's assessed value would need to be revised to reflect the additional square footage, and as the circumstances of the additions were, in his professional judgment, beyond the scope of routine county surveying. The county clerk, a man named Wilbur Short, age 47, read Pruitt's report and flagged it for the state capitol in Frankfort. The state sent a representative. a man whose name appears in the file only as J. Donovan, with no title, no department affiliation, and no further identification. Donovan arrived in Breathitt County in August of 1903 and visited the Hensley property. He spent one night in the house. His written account of that night was submitted to the state capitol. It was placed in a file. The file was classified. It has not been officially released. What is known about Donovan's visit comes from two sources. The first is Oda Hayes, who spoke with Ruth the day after Donovan left, and whose account of that conversation was recorded in the 1937 WPA interview. The second is a brief notation in the Breathitt County Clerk's records, written by Wilbur Short, that reads, State Representative J. Donovan visited Hensley property, August 18th and 1903. Departed morning of 19th. Appeared shaken. Stated report would be filed with Frankfurt. No copy left with county office. Matter referred to state. Appeared shaken. Oda Hayes told the WPA field worker what Ruth had told her about Donovan's visit. Ruth said the state man had arrived in the late afternoon, had walked through the house with a notebook, had measured the rooms, had examined the junction points the same way Pruitt had, and had then asked if he could stay the night. Ruth had agreed. She had given him the fourth room, the one with the bed. In the morning, Donovan was in the kitchen before Ruth woke. He was sitting at the table. He was not writing. He was not measuring. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at the wall. Ruth asked him if he had slept well. He said he had not slept. She asked him why. He said, and Ruth repeated this to Oda, who repeated it to the WPA field worker, who wrote it down in 1937. He said, Mrs. Hensley, at approximately 2 o'clock this morning, while I was lying in the bed in the room you gave me, I heard sounds in the wall. Not the sounds of an animal, not the sounds of settling timber, the sounds of construction, the sounds of boards being placed, of joints being fitted, of a structure being assembled with care and precision. The sounds came from the eastern wall of the room, the wall that faces the outside of the house. They continued for approximately 1 hour. Then they stopped. When they stopped, I got out of bed and examined the wall. It was the same wall. But behind it, on the other side, I could feel warmth. New warmth. The warmth of a new space. Ruth told Oda that she had walked with Donovan to the eastern wall of the fourth room. She had put her hand on the wall. It was warm. Not the warmth of the room itself, which was always warm. A different warmth, coming from the other side. But it was August. It was not December, and the rooms only appeared in December. Whatever Donovan had heard in the wall that night, whatever process was generating the warmth on the other side, it had not completed. It had started and stopped. A rehearsal, perhaps, or a reminder. Donovan left that morning. He did not say goodbye in the conventional sense. He told Ruth, according to Oda's account, Mrs. Hensley, I am going to recommend to the state that this property be left alone. I do not believe there is anything harmful occurring here. But I do not believe there is anything here that the state of Kentucky is equipped to address. He left. His report was filed. The file was classified. Ruth Hensley's house received its 7th room in December of 1903, 4 months after Donovan's visit, an 8th in December of 1904, a 9th in 1905. The rooms continued to appear, one each December, with the same consistency and the same inexplicability for the remainder of Ruth's life. She died in 1921 at the age of 67. The Breathitt County death record lists the cause as pneumonia. By the time of her death, the house had approximately 28 rooms. The original 4 plus 24 that had appeared over 24 consecutive Decembers, without interruption, without explanation, and without anyone ever witnessing the process by which they were made. 28 rooms. In a house that had been built for a family of 2. In a house where only one person had lived since 1894. 28 rooms, each one furnished, each one warm, each one seamlessly joined to the structure, as though it had always been there. This detail stopped me. It still does. Ruth Hensley lived alone in a 28-room house for the last years of her life. She used some of the rooms. Others she simply left as they had appeared. Furnished, warm, waiting. She did not know who they were waiting for. She did not ask. She accepted the house the way she had accepted everything else, in a life that had included a dead husband, a hollow in the bloody Breathitt, and the particular solitude of a woman who has no children and no near neighbors, and who has learned, over decades, to find company in the structure around her. Oda Hayes visited Ruth for the last time in the autumn of 1920, a few months before Ruth's death. Oda was 70 by then. The walk up the ridge was difficult. She had not visited in more than a year. When she arrived at the property, she stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the house. She told the WPA field worker, 17 years later, that she stood there for a long time. The house that had been 4 rooms when Thomas Hensley built it, filled her entire field of vision. It sprawled across the ridge in a shape that had no name, extending in directions that seemed to follow no logic, except the logic of the December additions, each one attached to the previous year's room in a chain that had wound and doubled back and extended and branched until the original 4-room cabin was somewhere in the middle of a structure that resembled, from the outside, nothing so much as a living thing that had grown according to its own internal plan. She said, it didn't look like a house anymore. It looked like something that was wearing a house. Something that had started as a house and had kept going because it didn't know how to stop, or because it wasn't finished yet, or because the thing it was building toward hadn't arrived yet. She went inside. She found Ruth in the kitchen, the original kitchen, the first room Thomas had built, still in the center of the house, still functioning, the stove still burning, the coffee still hot. Ruth was smaller than Oda remembered, thinner, older, but not unhappy, not frightened. She was a woman who had made peace with something extraordinary, and who carried that peace the way some women carry grief. Quietly, privately, without asking anyone else to understand it. Oda asked her how many rooms there were now. Ruth said she had stopped counting. She said it didn't matter. She said the rooms were not the point. The rooms were what something was doing while it waited. What it was waiting for, she did not know. But the rooms were warm, and the curtains were clean, and the beds were made, and that was enough. Oda asked, waiting for what? Ruth looked at her for a long time. Then she said, I think it's building a place for someone. I don't think it's for me. I think I'm just the one who happened to live here while it worked. She died 4 months later. She was 67 years old. The Breathitt County death record, which is real, and which is in the courthouse in Jackson, lists her cause of death as pneumonia, and her address as the Hensley property on the North Fork Ridge. The assessor's notation beside the death record reads, structure on property, irregular dimensions, not reassessed. The house continued to grow after she died. The property passed to a distant cousin, a man named Harlan Combs, who lived in Jackson and who had no interest in occupying a house 7 miles from town on a ridge above the river. He visited the property once in the spring of 1922 to to assess its condition. He found 29 rooms. Ruth had died in February. It was now April. A new room had appeared in December, as always, 3 months before her death. But the 29th room, the one Harlan found that was not on Ruth's informal accounting, had appeared after she died, in a house with no living occupant. Harlan Combs did not visit the property again. He did not sell it. He did not demolish it. He simply left it alone, as J. Donovan had recommended to the state 20 years earlier. The property was visited periodically over the following decades by people whose reasons ranged from curiosity to official duty. The WPA field worker who interviewed Oda Hayes in 1937 visited the property and noted that the house appeared to contain approximately 35 rooms, which would be consistent with continued annual growth since Ruth's death. A county tax assessor visited in 1948 and noted with evident frustration that the property's footprint did not match any record on file. A local historian named Margaret Holbrook visited in 1961 and photographed the exterior, producing the only known photographs of the structure. Photographs that show a building of extraordinary and irregular dimensions, sprawling across the ridge in a pattern that follows no architectural logic. A house that has been growing for 64 years, without a blueprint and without a builder. Holbrook's photographs, there are 7 of them, are in the Breathitt County Historical Society's collection. I have seen reproductions. They show a structure that defies description in conventional terms. The roofline changes direction multiple times. Wings and extensions project from the main body at angles that no architect would choose. Windows appear at irregular intervals, some of them at heights that suggest rooms with unusually high ceilings, or rooms built at different levels from their neighbors. The siding, the same type of board throughout as Pruitt had noted in 1903. Weathers at the same rate across the entire structure, as though every room, from the oldest to the newest, had been exposed to the same number of years of Kentucky weather. Holbrook wrote a brief note to accompany her photographs. It reads, "I counted the windows on the south face of the structure and arrived at a number I am not confident in because the face is not flat. It curves and jogs and recedes in ways that make accurate counting from any single vantage point impossible. My best estimate is 47 windows on the south face alone. If each window corresponds to a room, and if the other 3 faces of the structure are similarly windowed, then the total number of rooms in the structure may be in excess of 100. I do not have the equipment or the time to conduct a full count. I am not sure I want to. The last sentence, I am not sure I want to, is the closest any observer has come to acknowledging the quality that the house seems to produce in the people who see it. Not fear, exactly, something more like the awareness that you are looking at something that is still in process, still working, still adding to itself, with the patient persistence of something that has been given a task and intends to complete it, regardless of how long it takes or whether anyone is watching. I don't have an answer. I've looked. There isn't one. The house is still there, or what remains of it is still there. The structure began to deteriorate in the 1970s, when portions of the roof collapsed under winter snow loads that the original 4-room house would have shed without difficulty, but that the sprawling, multi-room structure could not sustain. The deterioration has continued since. Portions of the house have collapsed. Others are still standing. Rooms added in the 1910s and 1920s, built by no hand that anyone has identified, still holding their shape more than a century after they appeared. Whether the rooms continued to appear after the roof began to fail, whether the house kept growing even as it was collapsing, is a question that no one has been in a position to answer because no one has lived on the property since Ruth Hensley died in 1921, and the people who have visited it over the decades have not visited often enough or stayed long enough to observe whether a new room appears each December in a house that no one occupies. But the WPA count in 1937 was 35 rooms. The tax assessor's frustrated notation in 1948 suggests the number was higher. Margaret Holbrook's photographs in 1961 show a structure that is larger than either earlier count would produce. The house kept growing for how long after Ruth died, and whether it is growing still, and what the rooms are for, and who, or what, has been building them with such care and such consistency for more than a century, furnishing them, warming them, hanging the curtains and positioning the chairs beside the windows and making up the beds with clean sheets for guests who have never arrived. These are questions that Josiah Pruitt's report does not answer, that Jay Donovan's classified account does not answer, that Ruth Hensley, in 24 years of living in a house that grew around her every December, never answered and never tried to answer. She said, "If something built it, it built it with care. I am not afraid of something that builds with care." She lived in that house for 24 years after the first room appeared. She slept in a bed that no one had made. She sat in a chair that no one had placed. She looked through windows that no one had cut, and every December, without fail, the house gave her another room. She never found out why. Neither have we. The surveyor's report is in the box. The box is in the basement. The basement is in the courthouse in Jackson, Kentucky. The courthouse is real. The box is real. The report is real. The house on the ridge, whatever is left of it, whatever rooms are still standing, whatever rooms may have appeared since the last person climbed that ridge and counted, is real too. And if something is still building there, in the dark Decembers of Breathitt County, adding rooms to a house that no one lives in, for reasons that no one has ever been able to name, it is building with care. It has always built with care, and the rooms are still warm.
Thank you for walking this path with me to the end. Tell me in the comments what time zone you're in right now. Let this frame leave a trace across the whole world. And subscribe to Behind the Photo. I'm already preparing the next story.